we've got one more panel. Actually, it's a very important panel, and thank you very much for being here with us on this panel. The use of petroleum in transportation fuels is one of our biggest sources of greenhouse gases. And what we want to do in the next few minutes is talk about efforts to move us beyond that. We've got a great panel here, and so I want to start down at the far end. I want to introduce Lawrence Bloom, who's the head of BE Energy. He's got a great effort going with the government of Paraguay to make them completely self-sustaining. He's doing a cross-border fund to help the United States and China move away from reliance on petroleum-based fuels. Next to him is David Bloom. David is the CEO and founder of Bloom Distillation. He's an expert in biofuels production, and he also appears, if you're up late at night and driving, you can hear him occasionally on Coast to Coast. Now, David, I know you got an award from the National Corn Growers Association. If you're on Coast to Coast, is it true that there's aliens in those cornfields that don't? No, I'm not going to ask you that. Let's hold that for later. I want to introduce Suzanne Hunt. She's the CEO of Green LLC. She's also an advisor to the Carbon War Room, and she advises on transportation, energy, growth, the environment. She directed World Watch Bioenergy Program for several years before she set up her own company. And I want to also introduce Morgan Williams, who's the Chief Sciences Officer at Biochar, which is into how to make carbon negative either fuel or fertilizer and help the planet. So we're going to be discussing here how to get off petroleum-based fuels. And I'd like to begin next. So we put the renewable fuel standard in 2005 and then improved it in 2007. And what it dictates by law is that we've got to put 36 billion gallons of renewable transportation fuel will be in the market by 2022. That was 15 years from the time the act was enacted. Seemed like plenty of time. We went through the 2008 financial crisis. A lot of the funding got cut off from a lot of the more visionary biofuel firms. But as the authors of the legislation saw it, there would be first-generation fuels, which is basically corn ethanol, shown in dark green, then the advanced biofuels, and then the cellulosic biofuels. Advanced biofuels are things like sugar or sorghum, and then the cellulosic, and then beyond that, of course, there would be drop-in fuels that would be things that were like algae that would release petroleum when they secrete their wastes. So that's the plan that we're operating on, and that's what the fight is, because when this program was put in place, we were using 130 billion gallons of liquid fuel a year, and we were expected to grow that amount by 1 or 2% every year. So the oil industry went along with this at a time where it was envisioned that there was peak oil, that U.S. oil resources were declining, that the bill for imported fuel was going up, and that there'd be still plenty of room to sell whatever gasoline and diesel they had in the market. Conditions have changed. Next slide, please. So what we wanted to do was enhance energy security, improve the environment, and stimulate economic growth and development. We've done that already with corn-based ethanol, and more to follow. But just so you know, this renewable fuel standard is now the #1 legislative objective target of the American Petroleum Institute. It's been that way for 2 years. They are determined to get this thing modified, killed, or somehow dispensed with so that there's less competition at the pump. They rule the island, as we say it, where the pumps are. So when you go in with your advanced biofuel and say, I'd like to get it marketed, it's up to Exxon or Chevron or one of these mid-majors who control the pumps to say, okay, we'll take your fuel and we'll shut down our refinery. Not going to happen easily. So this is a big fight, and this is the policy fight behind this. But we are making progress. Could I have the next slide, please? We're now at E10. E15 is approved. Let's see. EPA's proposed rule is last summer, when the price of corn soared, they got to the White House and scared the White House into reducing the standard for renewable fuels. So that's still being fought 12 months later. The 2014 standard hasn't been approved yet. We're halfway through. Gasoline prices, ethanol is cheaper by around 70 cents a gallon than gasoline, so every bit of it that goes in gasoline reduces it. And my corn farming friends wanted me to explain to you that because of the renewable fuel standard, we've added as much to the corn crop since 2005 as we've used in ethanol. So essentially, we've left the food on the table. We take the ethanol, take the starch out of it, and leave dried distiller's grain. It's just, our problem is the oil industry. Can you imagine? It's about economics, and they don't like us. Next slide. Next slide is going to show you a picture of the plant that's opening in Iowa for Poet, which is the nation's largest ethanol producer. Poet is going to use the leftovers in the field after they harvest the corn. And they take this and they pull they grind it up and they take the starch out of the corn. They call it stover. And so this is a 20 million gallon a year plant. It's the first, and there are 3 more from different companies coming online this year. It's the first real bulk marketing of cellulosic ethanol. It's not as cheap yet, but it will be cheap as we move to mass production and mass production of the enzymes in it. So that's kind of where we are right now. That's the current state of the fight. I want to ask our panelists, and let's start with David if we could, and how are we doing, and are we going to be able to move beyond petroleum-based fuels?
Well, that's absolutely the case around the world. Not everyone here may know that Brazil doesn't import any oil whatsoever for transportation fuel. 95% of the cars made in Brazil run on alcohol right now, and most of the rest of them have been converted. That's the 5th largest country in the world by landmass, and they've already done it, and yet you don't see press about it here. The way we're going to do this, though, is to go around the various roadblocks that everybody's been talking about at this conference, which the people, as General Clark pointed out, the people who are in charge of our current energy like being in charge of it. And everything they can delay renewables with is going to be done. And that's been a 100-year war with the oil companies over alcohol. After all, Rockefeller funded the women's Christian temperance movement to buy Congress and pass prohibition. And you guys thought it had to do with drinking. So those dirty tricks have been going on a long time. And this is yet another one, this renewable fuel standard. You got to remember, we used to have the Clean Air Act, which mandated oxygenated fuel. Alcohol has oxygen in it. To get tax credits for alcohol fuel, the oil companies said you can't have the RFS, the renewable fuel standard, and the oxygenate standard. You're going to have to trade. And I said, don't go to the RFS, because the Clean Air Act was immutable. You can't poison people with the byproducts of gasoline. And yet, if you go to the renewable fuel standard, it's optional whether or not we make the economic compromise to keep alcohol in the thing. Oil Patch Perry, Texas governor, got a $9,000 plane flight by the Poultry Association to go and try to fight the RFS with the EPA, and they told him to, take a hike. But these constant battles are draining the ability of us to go forward and bring in investment, because if there's doubt, investors won't put in the money. So where we have to go is around this. We have to make sure that we make alcohol on a scale that we can do it with small-scale capitalism, and doing that, we can go ahead and actually spread alcohol very fast. Our company focuses on advanced biofuels from a wide variety of things, and our biggest plant will be 5 million gallons a year, because that's the sweet spot where it's most profitable. Cellulose, that's the son of food versus fuel. First it was, you can't use corn for alcohol, which was a phony argument from the start. We don't have time to explain it. But following that was, well, then just use cellulose. You see, that's not food. Well, trying to break cellulose apart into its 10,000 component sugar molecules is hard. Trees make cellulose to be durable. It's really hard to break it down. And so we delay again the switch to alcohol by picking a grail that nobody can reach, or it takes an enormous amount of money to do it. So what we're going to do, I think, around the world, and the rest of the world's already going there, is start increasing photosynthesis by growing materials we can make into alcohol, or we take the 1 billion tons of food processing waste that is currently out there, and we can make tens of billions of gallons of alcohol from that. So I'm not interested at all in transition. I'm interested in revolution because, as our last panel said, we only have 15 years. But of course, if you look at the Iraq War, and that was around 15 years, a little less, if we took the money that we put into that, trying to get our oil from out underneath Iraq's sand, and instead loaned it to countries around the world to make ethanol, we'd already be off of fossil fuels and fully renewable, and the byproduct food would have everyone fed. That's the kind of revolution we need to do.
Okay, thank you, David. Lawrence?
Thank you, David. I'm going to be a little less technical, a little bit more personal. I created B-Energy for two purposes. One, to create a sustainable company, or company creating a sustainable product, because however fast we evolve, we're going to need gasoline for the cars that are on the road now and will be coming onto the road for the next few years before it all becomes electric. And secondly, I wanted to create a new model for corporations. So what I did was I created a triple bottom line company that will be responsible not only for making a profit, because clearly we have to do that, but would look to the health and education of all its employees in the developing world where we work. It's quite extraordinary, you know. The average cost of one of our projects will be about $150 million. The cost of creating clinics and educational facilities are probably less than 1% of that. And so simultaneously with creating B-Energy, what I did was I applied for 501c3 status in the US and got approval from the UN to create a UN IGO. And what I intend to do within a couple of years is to go before a number of ambassadors in the UN to say, this is where the bar should be for any company now coming into your country. This is where the bar should be for responsibility for the community and the employees that they hire. So we would expect to employ about 1,000 people on any one of our plantations and working our technology. Where possible, and I can tell you, when I look at the figures, the ROIs are so high that it's not too difficult to create opportunities for further education for the adult workers, nursery education for the children, creches. So we'd end up growing people as well as growing product. And that seems to me to be the role that business should be taking wherever it works. The reason I chose Paraguay, because you always need, when you're starting something new, to get an early win. And Paraguay seemed to me to be a possibility of an early win. 7 million people. They already get a huge proportion of their energy through hydro, which is considered green. So we don't have to push too hard to get there. But it seemed to me that when we got there, it would be worthwhile because we could prove we could be sustainable, we could have a triple bottom line, and we could take an entire country to sustainability.
Suzanne, thank you very much, Lauren. Suzanne, you've been thinking about the policy end of this a lot in Carbon War Room and so forth. What do you have to say to us about where the direction and what's it look like?
We've been looking at policy just because it's a huge part of the picture, but the number one aspect of this that we're focused on right now is actually the financial hurdles. Before I dive into that, I just wanted to say thank you to Chip for the invitation. And I have to admit, now I'm kicking myself for not making it last year and the year before. Sorry, Chip. So how many folks here know about the Carbon War Room? Okay, so I don't need to explain. So for the few folks who don't, we're actually a not-for-profit, but we were created by Richard Branson and a group of other incredibly successful entrepreneurs who are worried about the state of the planet. And the reason we're not for profit is so that we can look sector by sector and look at the solutions, the profitable solutions to climate change, and then figure out what's holding them back and then attempt to implement a strategy to remove those barriers. So how many folks know Jigger Shaw? Almost everybody. So when Jigger asked me to help out with biofuels a number of years ago, being a glutton for punishment, I said, I'll help with biofuels, but I'd like to look at aviation first, since the aviation sector has arguably much more limited options for reducing their climate impact. They can move to more efficient aircraft, they can switch to low carbon fuels, or they can improve the air traffic control system, which is a massively slow process involving all the governments of the world. So as the entrepreneurial NGO, we decided that biofuels really did make sense as that lever that we could help tackle. And when we looked at what was all of the challenges facing this industry, there are these enormous policy challenges, as General Clark has been talking about, enormous technical challenges, et cetera. But I chose to focus in on the information barrier, since my job was to help facilitate the flow of massive sums of money from the private markets flowing into this industry. I didn't feel comfortable advising finance providers or purchasers based on the quality and the amount of information that was available about the advanced biofuel sector. So built a database, worked with scientific publishers. Bloomberg now has a biofuels database. The next major hurdle to the industry that we've been looking at is sustainability. And so I won't go into that, but if you're not producing the fuel sustainably, it undermines your whole argument for doing it, because it's a heck of a lot easier to just buy petroleum-based fuels. So that's an important part of what we do. And so getting back to finance as the key hurdle to this industry, there are a whole lot of companies that are, they've got their pilot facilities, they've got their demonstration facilities, they are ready to build and produce at commercial scale and usher in this revolution that we're talking about, but no one wants to finance that first production facility because it's far more expensive than the second or the third or the fourth. And this isn't an industry where you can put in $10 million and try out a new technology. We're talking hundreds of millions into the billions of dollars. And no one that's going to provide that scale of capital wants to take any risk. So what we're working on at the War Room is we're working with our airline partners, the Virgin Airlines, Delta Airlines, and the airline industry associations, CAFE and others. And we're working on putting together an innovative deal where we reduce the risk, we share the risk. We have a number of incredible people who've spent their careers at large financial institutions advising. And we're essentially trying to put together a deal with our airline partners and choosing some of the top advanced biofuel producers where we essentially we're essentially doing a forward access deal where we hope to sell options contracts for renewable jet fuel instead of fossil fuel. We're going to be putting out a request for information in a few weeks, so anyone in the room that's a producer, keep an eye out for that. And then hopefully by this time next year, I'll get to tell you about the deal we put together. That's a long way away, but that's what we're working on.
In other words, there are policy challenges, there are financial challenges, and I'm glad we've got people like Carbon War Room really focused on this. Now, Morgan, you've been looking at the technology side of it, and your issue is how do we do this in the most carbon negative way? So the whole idea behind renewable fuels is that we're using something that takes carbon out of the atmosphere rather than fossilized carbon out of the ground. And plants do that. That's why we like biofuels. But unfortunately, in the process of converting the plant starch and sugar into a liquid fuel, we have to supply energy. So if we're going to cultivate, we have diesel fueled tractors running in the field and diesel fueled harvesters. And in some cases, we're using natural gas to heat our ethanol plants to keep the yeast solution at the right temperature. So we're still using carbon-based fuels. And this means that even though biofuels are theoretically carbon neutral, they aren't in practice carbon neutral. They are much less carbon intensive than gasoline or diesel, but they're not carbon free. Now, Morgan, tell us about how we can actually move and become carbon negative, because that's the goal.
Gosh, General, that last statement just makes me so excited that you are actually talking about that. That is awesome. You know, we have to step back and really look at why we're transitioning to anything, and it's because we have a carbon issue. So if our solution is just as carbon intensive as what we're replacing, then where do we really get? If we're at 400 and so ppm and change and CO2 in the atmosphere, that's already too much. Effectively, we need to draw down that carbon resource in the atmosphere, and there's some ways to do that. And Graciela, earlier in the conference, really eloquently stated some of the opportunities to accomplish that. So in the biofuel space, you know, as a soil scientist, I get really concerned. You talk about peak oil. I'm concerned about peak soil. And peak soil is something that is far more difficult to actually address than peak oil, I believe. So if we're going after extractive technologies and extractive techniques that rely on industrial farming situations to provide feedstocks to feed, at best, carbon neutral biofuel technologies, I think that's a real risk for us moving forward. When the Midwest, you know, we're eroding soil every year, and the perpetuation of that overseas to grow biofuels and, you know, clear cutting of tropical forests and land grabbing by, you know, who knows who. That's a very challenging thing for me to get really excited about and on board. So when we talk about carbon negative opportunities, I'm excited to say that they do actually exist, and there are choices that we can make to pursue those opportunities. I represent a technology called biochar. It's one of those ways of actually farming CO2 out of the air via photosynthesis. So we rely on plants. Plants have evolved over a billion years to actually remove CO2 as an energy source, fixed sugar, in their biomass, and it sits there. They're very good at doing this. So biochar is basically a technology that you can take that tree or take that, whatever it might be, grass, even algae has been used for this, and thermochemically convert this stuff and stabilize that carbon into a solid product, a liquid product, and a gaseous product. So based on how you tune this machine, you get different fractions of different things out of this equipment. My technology that we have is largely focused on the solid product, which is the char. We're looking at feeding the soil, and we get a gas out. The gas is used or installed at lumber mills to actually offset natural gas for heating in the lumber mill operation. So we get the energy use of the heat coming off the unit, and then the solid value of the char that we then bank in the soil to increase fertility, reduce moisture, and achieve carbon negativity. We have not yet been able to achieve a liquid fuel for this because it's a cost-benefit analysis. We either have a solid, we either have a gas, or we have a liquid. And there are massive energy costs in converting the gas to a liquid at the scale that we're accomplishing this. So also as a soil scientist, I think like a detritivore. And a detritivore is an organism that seeks wastes, and they see opportunity in waste. And they're what makes nutrient cycling happen all over the planet. So on a global scale, even a national scale, when you talk about energy policy, renewable energy policy, biofuel policy, it's not that easy. Every little situation is different because every region is different, every farming community is different, every climate is different. So I think the whole concept of a national biofuel policy is challenging for those very reasons. And I really think it's up to us to look at those niche opportunities to find these waste resources first to get the end goal that we really want.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for doing it.
Yeah.
So now look, the last panel you didn't get a chance to ask questions. So we've got a few minutes here. You've heard about business, you've heard about policy, you've heard about finance, you've heard about technology. You're dealing with something that's more than 30% of our carbon footprint, and that's transportation fuel. So please, what are your questions of our panelists? In the back. Need a microphone.
Hi, I would like to know, is the same corn that is being used for ethanol also the corn we're talking about that will compete with cotton?
Well, we're talking about number 2 feed corn, and that's what we're using for ethanol.
Is that the
And
same
so I don't know
corn?
that I don't understand whether it competes with cotton or not, but it's not what you're eating. I'm not saying you couldn't eat it, but it's not popcorn, it's not corn on the cob, it's grown for animal consumption. And what's done with the corn is that you take the starch out of it and you leave the protein and the fat in it and the fiber, and that goes back into the animal feed chain.
But is that coming from the same corn that the campaign is corn will compete with cotton for investment?
Well, if I
Go
could
ahead,
address
David.
that a little bit. Corn ethanol is at pretty much a full stop in the United States because any incentives exclude corn. So we've actually are transitioning out of corn into advanced biofuels. And that's only really because of political agendas. But where we're going is into crops that maybe don't grow where there's any other crop. For instance, we all know about agave, right? Remember the last time you drank too much tequila? You know, you can talk about buffalo gourd that grows in arid areas. These are not considered part of the 1.5 billion acres of farmland we have, of which only 7% is used by corn. So if you think it's the whole ball game of our agriculture, it's not. We've got coffee pulp in the tropics, which is the second largest commodity in the world after oil. That coffee pulp is a fruit, and we can make enough alcohol out of that to be equal to the revenue from the coffee and relieve the balance of payments for most coffee-producing nations. We can be talking in arid areas about crops that provide an incredible amount of nitrogen to the soil and don't need any fertilizer, like mesquite, where the pods are 35% sugar, and there's as many acres of mesquite growing wild as there is corn in the United States. So when you talk about ethanol, you really got to start thinking way beyond corn, because corn is basically frozen at this point politically. And advanced biofuels is where the new frontier is. And we don't have to go to cellulose anytime soon, because with most of these advanced biofuels, we can make it for $1, $1.50 a gallon. And cellulose, it'll be a while before it gets to be that cheap. So, you know, we don't have to wait. We don't have to wait the 15 years. I've been going to alcohol conferences,
Okay,
and so is General
Suzanne,
Clark.
you wanted to jump in on this very critical question of corn and ethanol.
Well, I think the questioner raises one of the core challenges to the biofuels industry, which is it's all about the land use. And so there's no getting around pressure on our agricultural lands. And so what's happening is we have a global agriculture system that is not currently sustainable. As we're pointing out, 40% of all agricultural lands around the world are severely degraded. We have an energy system that is highly unsustainable. And then biofuels comes in and it sits at the intersection of those two already unsustainable sectors, and it adds even more pressure to our ecosystems. So potentially, if done wrong. If done right, it takes pressure off. And so part of this fascinating transition that we're in right now is corn ethanol, you know, paved the way. It showed that these fuels can be made, that they work, that they can be made to work with our current logistics systems. But you have to transition to waste feedstocks, and you have to really amp up efficiency. And part of the difference in the marketplace now that the general alluded to is that when the renewable fuel standard was passed, we were using more and more fuel, and actually gasoline use is going down in the United States. That's exactly what we want. We want that to keep going down, and we want more and more sustainable fuels to be produced. And the land use issue is absolutely core. So thank you for bringing that up.
Okay, now I want I want one more word on this. We've still got a few minutes left. I just want to make sure on agriculture, there's a couple of things I've learned. I didn't grow up on a farm, but I spent a lot of time with people who do farm in the Midwest, and there's a couple of things they would want me to tell you. Number one, they would want me to tell you that if you want more food in the world, you have to raise the price of the food so the farmer makes more money on it. So
Yep.
I know this sounds really bad, but in fact, it actually works. If you want lots of corn, then have corn at $6 or $7 a bushel. If you want to put farmers in Africa out of business, reduce the price of corn to $3 a bushel, and then the U.S. excess will be shipped to Africa, and they will not be able to compete with it. Now, that's what's happened in the past. So last year, the price of corn hit $8. This year, the consequence was predictable. We're going to have a record corn crop. And what's that going to do next year? It's going to reduce the corn crop because farmers are going to move away from it. This is a market that responds to supply and demand. Second point is, agricultural productivity is not quite as limited as some people would have us believe. Now, I do worry about the total amount of food in the world, but for example, there's a guy in Iowa that I've met who is producing corn that will yield 375 bushels an acre. He's done hybridized breeding, and he can make a smaller, narrower corn plant without sacrificing the yield. So you've got more plants per acre, and you get more corn per acre. When we grew corn back in the Depression in this country, we were getting 50 and 60 bushels an acre. In 1970, we were at 90 bushels an acre. This year, the Department of Agriculture says we're going to be producing 170 bushels an acre on average. And so when you've got growth in productivity, you've got margin to do things with. So it's not black and white on this, on the biofuels thing, and even and what the impact on the food supply is. My final point is there's 1 billion acres of unused farmland in the world. That needs to be and will be used when the economics dictate that it's usable. Okay, there were questions, and I'm sorry to talk so long. Right here in the center.
Hi, Chris Albrecht, Gulfstream Renewable. Excuse me, Chris Albrecht, Gulfstream Renewables. I would like to ask. You were saying that we already have a lot of waste, a billion tons of waste. What would be the best type of waste that would be most accessible, and how would we maximize usage of that waste to turn to ethanol?
Well, when it comes to food processing waste, we have 20,000 plants in the United States that produce enough waste to produce 2 million gallons of alcohol each. What are these plants? They're bakeries, they're places that make pretzels, they're places that make cookies. All of these things that have starch or sugar in them have enormous amounts of waste. In the wider picture, the billion tons that the Food and Agriculture Organization attributes to food processing waste doesn't count things that aren't food, like coffee, which isn't food. So coffee being, as I said, the second largest commodity, is an enormous source. Agave, because tequila isn't food, although there's some college students that would disagree. But agave can be grown in deserts around the world and yields 6,000 gallons an acre every 6 years, or 1,000 gallons an acre a year. But the real answer to, along with the lines of the question about land use and what General Clark was saying, is we have to change agriculture. And so to do that, we have to look to nature for an example, and that's polyculture. So if you grow in an arid area, mesquite, above agave, above prickly pear cactus, above buffalo gourd, you get, instead of 300 or 400 gallons an acre, as you would with corn, you get 3,000 or 4,000 gallons an acre, because plants only use so much sunlight. They're very efficient in using only a fraction. When we layer agriculture, we avoid the problems of monoculture, we avoid the pest problems, and we harvest solar energy at its maximum efficiency. Polycultures are done around the world, but not in the US, because big corporations don't want to hire labor. You need fingers to harvest this stuff.
Okay, let's see if we can get 3 or 4 questions before we answer them. Then I'll ask all our panelists to try to do 1-sentence, 2-sentence answers, tough as it is. Okay, next question, where's the mic? This lady up here has a question, and after that, somebody over there had a question.
I suggest, can you get the government to subsidize planting corn?
Do we want the government to subsidize planting corn?
No, if you can get it, that would be a big help.
Okay.
I mean, it will tempt the ranchers to do that.
We already do.
I tell you because I come from a family.
Okay, we'll talk about that.
And in
Got it.
Argentina, it's the contrary. I am from Argentina. We have retentions.
Right.
That people
Okay,
stop
we'll talk
growing.
about that. Okay, there's a question over here.
Hi there, Jackie Chenoweth, CSU Master Gardener.
Put
CSU Master Gardener Jackie Chenoweth. Anybody talking about the potential of industrial hemp for biofuels? Henry Ford not only, yes, anybody talking about it? Anybody thinking about it? Henry Ford built the first car from industrial hemp and used industrial hemp to fuel it. And that was, where are we going with that? Is that even on the table? Thank you.
Okay, and one more question over here.
I would just like to address the issue of the the conservation challenge of the corn issue and the price. Millions of acres of marginal, marginal land have been plowed up after years and years of putting them in CRP, and I think it's a tragedy.
Okay, so now we've got three questions and comments. We've got about 3 minutes left, and we've got 5 panelists. Let's start down here and let's work through and get your last best shot in. David?
Okay, CRP is the way the corn farmers stay in business because you have to insure them to keep producing corn every year even when they lose money. So yes, we pay farmers to take land out of production periodically, but you're allowed to grow energy crops of certain kinds and off years. In terms of hemp, everything you make from hemp is far more valuable than the commodity of alcohol. Alcohol is, 60, 70 cents a pound. Everything else you make from hemp is more valuable. So economics go against using hemp for a fuel. And the first question was?
That's okay. We'll get the first question.
Oh, Argentina. Oh, Argentina needs...
Don't do like Argentina.
Okay. We love Argentina.
All right. Let's go to Lawrence.
My eldest daughter, Rebecca, is an expert in hemp. She just loves hemp. And she's done tests in a number of British universities to see how much carbon is extracted from the atmosphere and put back into the soil. But the only intelligent place that I can talk about hemp is China. But they are very interested in China. So a specific answer to your question is yes, there is something going on. I love my eldest daughter. Anything I can do to help her is...
Okay. Suzanne?
I'll tackle the waste and sustainability questions. And back up one of the things that you said, David. I think essentially we have to protect the wildlands that are left. And one of the mistakes that has been made in a number of places, including Europe, is putting these biofuels policies in place and mandates in place without really, really strong sustainability guidelines. So that's essential. And we need to always make sure, and there were real problems in the U.S. with the corn industry and others that didn't want to have those guidelines in place, and I think lessons were learned there and are still being learned, and it's a really important part of that, and I think that the transition that we're going through is towards much more sustainable agriculture for food, feed, fiber, and all these other products that we need from the landscape. And bringing in the knowledge of ecologists and concepts of biomimicry and polyculture is essential, and that's where there's huge opportunity. And in terms of these integrated cycles and using waste products, I helped Virgin Atlantic do a deal with a company called LanzaTech that produces fuel from carbon monoxide emitted from heavy industrial plants. There are also a number of advanced biofuel companies that take municipal solid waste and convert it to fuel and energy. So there are a whole array of waste that we're not using. Once they become valuable, obviously they become more scarce. But as we transition towards more sustainable agriculture and energy production, this is part of the transition.
All right, thank you, Suzanne. Morgan.
So I'll just say it simply. Plowing the soil for the production of oil is not sustainable. So that answers that one. We're heavily subsidizing corn already. It's happening all over the world.
You do it more?
No, I don't. I think corn is the most heavily subsidized crop in the world.
No, it's rice.
Is it rice? Okay, well, it's up there in the top 3. I wouldn't say that that's an opportunity to produce more biofuels in that way. The other question, hemp has not even been legal to produce in the U.S. for research purposes until very recently. There's some permits coming out, and people are starting to toy around with this, the oil and hemp seeds, et cetera. But you're right, it's worth more as a fiber than it is as a fuel. So thinking like a detritivore, there are better opportunities for the production of alcohol than the intentional production of hemp for alcohol. So,
Okay, so just a final word here. The takeaways are that we're trying to replace gasoline with other liquid fuels. We have policy problems, financing problems, and technology problems. But all the solutions underway thus far are less carbon intensive than gasoline. And so we may not be able to completely solve this problem until we go all electric with all renewable electricity. That's a long way off. What we've got to do is take steps that are practical, that reduce the carbon intensity of our lifestyle. And moving to biofuels thus far is one of those steps. There's lots of trade-offs in it, but remember, your farmer is keeping food on your table. This country is self-sufficient in agriculture, proud of it, and works hard to stay that way. If you want more food, give more money to the farmer, give him the incentive, and he will produce it. If you want him to grow hemp, give him the incentive, he'll grow it. Thank you very much. Give our panel a big round of applause, please.